Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all well, safe, and healthy in whichever time zone and country you're currently in. Welcome to the UNESCAP's Think Tank Roundtable for Singapore International Energy Week on sustainable connectivity in Asia Pacific. Today, we're going to discuss increased power system sustainability and resilience supported by connectivity. I have going to go ahead and take the moderator's prerogative and give a short presentation of why we at UNESCAP think this is a really important topic, but I think the bulk of the discussion and really the most relevant and interesting presentations will come after mine. First, for those who don't know me, my name is Matthew Wittenstein. I'm Section Chief for Connectivity at United Nations ESCAP. Connectivity is at the core of what ESCAP does. It's one of our core missions. And I want to talk a little bit why we think power system connectivity in particular is so critical to supporting the transition to cleaner, low carbon energy systems. Next slide, please. So why does connectivity matter? I think many of you have seen various versions of this before, but when we're talking about the development of power systems, we have to take into account certain trade-offs. We want to maintain a sufficient level of energy security, in other words, providing power reliably to all who need it. We want to ensure power is affordable to everyone, and we want to limit the environmental impact of our power system. Click through, please. So really, we refer to this as the energy trilemma. I'm sure many of you have heard this term before, and we see connectivity as a tool for helping to resolve this energy trilemma, to make it easier to meet all three of these goals simultaneously. Next slide. So I thought I'd just give a couple of quick examples of why we think connectivity is so useful in this regard. And I'll start with talking about sustainability very quickly. This is data that I pulled from Denmark's Energinet, their main TSO, just from the first 2 weeks of October. And I kind of picked those weeks at random, but you can see something I think quite interesting and clear in this chart. So the blue line is the production from wind. Wind power in Denmark makes up about 50% of power generation on average, and many hours quite a bit more than that. But of course, wind does not blow all the time. So the question for Denmark is, which is a relatively small country, how does Denmark balance all of the wind in its system, given its relatively small physical territory? And the answer is it does that through interconnections with its neighbors. The orange line represents net imports. And you can see very clearly that during periods when wind production spikes, so at the end of this period, there was a moment when wind production reached over 4 gigawatts. During that time, when there's more production than Denmark can consume domestically, it exports it to its neighbors. And when wind production declines or when demand increases, it either consumes it all domestically or imports from its neighbors. So significant levels of interconnection are really critical to Denmark's ability to balance the variability of generation in its system. Next slide. What about security? This is an old slide from an old International Energy Agency report, but I think it's quite relevant, and so I wanted to pull it up. In the European Union, they really do a lot to promote connectivity among the member states. And one of the reasons is security of supply. And when they've done a number of different modeling exercises showing the implications of trying to develop fully isolated national systems versus ones that are more fully integrated, what they find is integration helps to improve the security of supply by reducing the potential for outages. And it does this in part by increasing the diversity of supply and increasing the ability of countries to rely on their neighbors when they lose some supply domestically. So an integrated grid in a European context is a more secure grid, but the caveat there is only if it's supported by appropriate regulatory and market harmonization. So in other words, you can't just build an interconnector and expect everything to work well. You need to support that with a number of regulatory and market drivers and market infrastructure as well. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to point out is when we talk about connectivity, we're really talking about it at a large scale. But I think there's often a debate about the need, about whether the future of the power system is going to be global. We're going to try to interconnect at a broader level among multiple countries, or if it's going to be local. We have significant cost declines in solar PV on rooftops. We have really great innovations in battery technology. And so are we actually going to see a system that's much more local? And I wanted to talk here just very quickly, and I won't go through this in depth, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the trade-offs between local and global, and really about how we need to get the balance right. not about one or the other. So local and small generation, one trade-off there is you do have local control and you can avoid a lot of transmission investments. That saves you some cost, but the cost of rooftop solar PV, for example, compared to utility scale solar PV, rooftop is still significantly more expensive, and that will probably remain so just because of economies of scale. Similarly, battery technology, as much as it has come down in cost, remains expensive, whereas if we make our power systems larger, we can avoid the need for the storage through the ability to balance over larger geographic areas. The point is, but at the same time, with larger systems, we need to do more coordination. We have to invest in that transmission. We have to invest in the power system infrastructure to support the flow of power across multiple jurisdictions. The point is not to say that one is better than the other. I think really what I want to highlight here is that we need both. But the real question is, what is the right balance and how do we integrate small and local along with large and distant? Next slide. So to that last point, the only thing I wanted to highlight in terms of ESCAP's work today is a draft roadmap that we've developed on proposing a set of strategies towards interconnecting grids in Asia. This roadmap, which I've put the link to it at the bottom of the page, but I won't go through this in depth. It highlights 9 different strategies that we see as really critical to enabling connectivity across the region. And you can roughly break these down into 4 categories: strategies on improving planning, including, for example, coordinating transition planning across borders or developing regional master plans; on the development of infrastructure, mainly on mobilizing investment. These are capital intensive investments and they need to be supported, often through large development banks. We have to talk about trading and operations and what things look like in practice once you actually have built the infrastructure. And then there are a number of cross-cutting issues that I think go even beyond some of the technical challenges of interconnection and talk about things like building trust and political consensus. One of the important things to keep in mind that separates connectivity from other aspects of power system discussions is it often involves a geopolitical concern, multiple countries working together who may have different views on connectivity or different views on energy transition. So I'll leave it there. I just wanted to say that this is how we see this. This is how we've begun to discuss it internally within ESCAP, but we're still building up our own practice on connectivity. We're kind of early stages in this. I've only joined ESCAP 6 months ago. And so really, I think we have a lot of work ahead of us. Next slide. So I don't want to take more time than I need to from our speakers. I really just wanted to try to set the stage and give them a good, hopefully, introduction and give them a chance to dig deeper into many of these issues that I've tried to highlight here. So I'll leave it there with that, and I'll try to turn to my first speaker. Our first speaker is Mr. Lee Sang-wai from Singapore's Energy Markets Authority. Mr. Lee is the Director of Policy and Planning Department under the EMA of Singapore. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you everyone for coming to this morning's roundtable session. It's opportune that we are discussing cross-border power systems integration as the world works towards addressing climate change. Throughout human history, we have evolved from tribes to cities and countries. And during this journey, we have harnessed energy in increasingly efficient ways. We began with muscle power from humans and animals. We then tapped on natural resources for woods and wind, eventually harnessing fossil fuels. And this led to the first industrial revolution of steam power. And today, we are a globally connected civilization, fueled by the global trade of fossil fuels and an increasing share of renewables. And as we progress, we will see cross-border power trade playing a greater role at connecting our societies, at advancing humanity, and while we also tackle climate change. So, coming back to SIEW and Singapore, regional power grids are important to Singapore. Singapore announced its energy story ambitions last year at SIEW 2019. And one of these switches that will enable Singapore to transform our energy sector is the access to electricity through regional power grids. Regional power grids provide Singapore with the unique opportunity to tap on reliable, competitive, and clean energy. And this will help Singapore overcome its land constraints as we grow and decarbonize our energy sector. As announced by our minister at the opening keynote on Monday, the EMA, or the Energy Market Authority, will be launching an open, competitive request for proposal for 100 megawatts of trial electricity imports with Malaysia. And we thank the Malaysian government for this incredible opportunity to collaborate on electricity trade. As this is the first time Singapore is importing electricity, we will use this 2-year trial to test our regulatory framework, and we hope that the useful lessons from this trial can be scaled up to facilitate our larger ambitions for future electricity imports. On this note, we welcome good ideas from industry players and fellow governments on how electricity imports can help to transform our energy sector. Beyond our 2-year trial with Malaysia, Singapore will be participating in the Laos-Thailand Malaysia-Singapore Power Integration Project, or LTMS for short. As announced at the Singapore Energy Summit, Singapore will be signing the LTMS MOU at the 38th ASEAN Ministers for Energy meeting in November 2020 to advance the cooperation on cross-border power trade. The LTMS was first conceptualized by Singapore and Laos PDR in 2014 to pilot up to 100 megawatts of cross-border power trade through Thailand and Malaysia via existing interconnections. The LTMS will allow Singapore to tap on renewable energy from the broader region, and this also creates a pathfinder towards the broader ASEAN Power Grid vision. Moving on to the ASEAN Power Grid, or APG, this is an ASEAN-wide effort to expand our ASEAN multilateral electricity trade. Both exporting and importing countries stand to benefit from being able to access larger regional markets, which will promote infrastructure investment, increase grid integration of renewable energy, and enhance grid resilience. The ASEAN Center for Energy is currently developing the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan study, or AIMS-3, which looks at how ASEAN can optimize higher renewable energy penetration in the region. International cooperation is therefore key to the success of the LTMS and the APG, and we will continue to play an active and constructive role in these areas. In short, allow me to conclude with 2 key points. Singapore is working towards achieving electricity imports that are sustainable, competitive, reliable, and will benefit our citizens and businesses. And secondly, Singapore is keen to be a responsible contributor in the regional power grid so that we can build our collective low carbon future together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Very much appreciate your thoughts. Really great that Singapore is taking this topic so seriously, and there's so much excellent work going on in ASEAN. You know, I've been working with ASEAN member states for a number of years now, and I've been really excited to see the progress on the ASEAN Power Grid. And so it's really great to see, in particular, Singapore joining the LTMS and hoping to build it up into a broader trading framework for the region. So this is really great. So with that, I'd like to start to move to our presentations. And I think first up, we're very privileged today to have Audrey Zibelman, CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator, with us. Audrey, thank you so much for joining. Audrey, I don't think you have any slides, so I will just turn the floor to you if you're ready. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew, and I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And so, as everyone knows, Australia is a very big island. So when Matthew first invited us to come join today to talk about cross-border transfer, I sort of thought, well, why us? I mean, we're certainly looking at how we can be an exporter to the rest of Asia, but I think what really is clear is the relevancy of how Australia is a very big island or a big continent. plays into this discussion around how important it's going to be to think about connections going into the future. So to give you a bit of context, the Australian Energy Market Operator is responsible for operating the national energy market in Australia, which there are two big interconnections, one in the west and one in the east, and we oversee both of them. The one in the east, which is the one I'll talk about most today, is actually the largest single interconnection in the world. It travels 5,000 kilometers from the northern Queensland all the way to South Australia. And because it serves a population of about 23 million, which is, I know, very small from most world sizes, it's one of what we call the longest, skinniest interconnection in the world. And as a result, it's quite challenging. So what I wanted to do is talk to you a bit about today is some of the issues that AEMO is experiencing and how we're beginning to think of this issue as we move forward. So in Australia, one of the AEMO's jobs is to create what we call the Integrated System Plan, which is effectively the blueprint of the power system as we look out into the future. And we cover a 20-year future scenario. In that context, the thing that is really critical for us is over this period of time, we expect to see close to 2/3 of our large-scale fossil units retiring and being replaced by a combination of renewables as well as storage, as well as transmission. And that what we've done in our modeling, which is an engineering modeling that looks at both cost and capabilities of the power system, have identified that as these plants retire, the most low regrets alternative for the economy is this combination of resources, because the area is a very favorable area geography for wind and solar. So effectively what we're seeing is we'll have about 15 gigawatts of coal retire, and this is going to be from aging. And as they're replaced, we're expecting them to get replaced by about 26 gigawatts of renewables, which is on top of the renewables we already have, about 200% increase in rooftop solar, and about 20 gigawatts of storage or fast-acting gas. But the important part is that as the power system is transferring from one that is fossil-based to one that is renewables-based, the real fact is that none of this works. To get these free electrons happening, one of the things we have to do is make sure it's highly interconnected, because we want to take advantage of time diversity and geographic diversity. So we have the ability in an area like Australia to say that sometimes the wind may be blowing in South Australia when it's not blowing in New South Wales. The sun may be still shining in parts of the country when it's not shining somewhere else. So how do you take advantage of that diversity, both from a balancing period perspective, so we can export when we have to, and as well as import, but also make sure that we're optimizing these resources. The other piece, though, that we're also focused on, which is equally important, is to realize that the engineering challenges associated with integrating in large-scale renewables and rooftop solar. So for example, we all know in this industry that we worry about the super peaks of the system on the very hot days. The other thing that happens when we have large penetration of rooftop solars, we're seeing in Australia, is we move into mild days where there's a lot of sun and there's actually not enough usage of electricity. So here again, it's very critical for us to have storage so we can time shift. And when we have excess solar, we can absorb it and then use it in other parts of the day when we need it. So we keep the system operating in a safe envelope. Other challenges that we all need to think of are things like inertia and system strength, the frequency, the essential services necessary to operate the power system. So in addition to thinking about renewables, we're also thinking about what is the capability of the system need to be at, because as more and more of our economies think about electrification, it's going to be even more critical that we think about security of the system and also the ability of optimization. So I put the challenges sort of in multiple buckets of systems thinking that are very important. So one is, of course, is this concept of planning and understanding directionally where you want to go, because the other piece that I think is changing in power systems is we're moving away from thinking about the power system as simply a reliability construct, having enough, as one would say, kit on the ground to keep the lights on when the temperature is at its highest or usage is at its highest, to actually hosting capability, which is another concept around the ability of the power system to truly integrate in renewables as well as storage as other capabilities, because the issue is what level of renewables can you get to safely before compromising the reliability of the system. So it's thinking about it in a different way. The other piece is the complexity, as always, of building transmission compared to building other types of resources like wind and solar. And so making sure that the plans are there and you're getting the infrastructure built ahead of time. The other point is, as Matthew said, is we have to think about markets and regulatory systems. When you have free electrons that come out of a decarbonized power system, one of the things that happens is that you have to think about what you're valuing, because the marginal cost of energy is no longer potentially the most efficient way of managing, of thinking about what's efficient, because you have zero marginal cost resources. So rethinking the markets and rethinking the obligations of networks and things like that are going to be very important as we think about the transition. And then in terms of resiliency, the things that AEMO's worried about are certainly around temperature resiliency, redundancy. As many of you know, we had a very rough summer last summer with bushfires. So situational awareness and the ability to think about redundancy in the system is very important. And then also, to the extent that we use distributed energy resources, how we use those to balance out the security and reliability of the system and take advantage of them to co-optimize that, as well as the adjacent economies like transport and heating that may be also electrifying, or as many countries are looking at, the integration of hydrogen into the power systems, or the things that we think about as we think about the power system going forward. And then lastly are certainly the issues around cyber. And again, the importance of awareness and digitalization, the amount of information. To me, one of the things that's very critical for us as we think about into the future, and this is an area we're actually working on with some of our counterparts internationally who are also looking at managing power systems that have in excess of 50% renewables on the system, is the use of data and information. We simply can't run the power systems in the command and control format that we've had before. We have to think about the what ifs in a very different type of framing, because it's so much real time. You know, you can be affected by cloud cover or haze or humidity, in addition to time of use and time of day. And so it's all of these things require for a system operator to start to think about how we use machine learning, how do we use AI very differently in the power system. To me, these are the critical tools that have to be developed if we're going to be successful. So, and the interesting thing about all of this, when it comes down to it, whether you're talking about building a power system within a continent or cross-border, it's the same set of issues. The data needs are important, the planning needs are important, and then the engineering is very important. We're all entering into a frontier that is new for this industry. And so for us, and we are a proud founder of a group called the Global Power System Transmission Operators, where we're really looking at the moonshot of how do we identify these issues, work with research entities, and think about solving them in a way that could be used on a worldwide basis, because the ability to manage power systems using these very different resources, inverter-based system as opposed to those using central station power plant, is new to all of us. And it's something that we certainly are looking to solve in a very collaborative way. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Audrey, thank you so much for those really excellent remarks. I think you highlighted it all exactly right. The reason why we asked you to come and participate is because we really see connectivity as talking about a lot more than just international connectivity. What's going on in Australia is incredibly relevant. I think at some point I saw an interview with you where you referred to Australia as kind of a postcard from the future. And I think that's exactly right. You're experiencing things that the rest of the world is going to be experiencing in the coming years. And so you see it, I think, in a much more coherent and consistent way than many other countries do, because you as the AMO are looking down, from a high level, but also really digging deep into the working of the system all the way down to the household level. So I think everything you said is spot on. I see we're slightly ahead of time, actually. So if you don't mind, I might take the moderator's perspective and ask you one follow-up question, for moderator's prerogative, I should say. And just ask you one quick follow-up question. Something you mentioned, I think, is really critical on the coordination of infrastructure development. You mentioned the challenge of getting transmission development right while also having a changing system under you. Can you talk a little bit more about how you, as the AMO, focuses on the question how you can build out the infrastructure in a way that it can keep up with the rapid changes going on the ground in Australia?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for mentioning that. So, and Matthew, I think what we found, and when you were at IEA, we did a report. You did a report which I thought was really illuminating about how things change when renewables get to about 30% saturation rate. When they get to 50%. The world fundamentally changes on you. And because what happens is that these resources historically you sort of managed around, adapted to, really need to be integrated into your real-time operations. And that's really the focus of what we're doing and doing with some of our colleagues internationally who are in that same position in England, in Ireland, in Denmark, in California, and Texas. And it's all because of these mutual learnings we all have to do. But to your point, one of the things that I think is really critical is this idea is building, not building in reaction to generation or in reaction to load growth, which is what we built the power systems for in the last century, but actually building the power system to accommodate renewables so that you think about the hosting capability. And we're in one of the things we're doing in Australia is creating what we call renewable energy zones. They're almost like economic zones, but this time it's for renewables. And what we do is we look at the hosting capability that we're going to require and where is the best location for the wind, where is the best location for the solar or whatever resources you're going to put in. How do you work with the communities, include the local units of government? Because one of the differences, of course, with renewables is the amount of land that is requires you much greater coordination. And then make sure that the capability of the system is there to provide the firming capability, the other types of services such as system strength and inertia that's necessary in order to manage the power system. So it is really, it's very much like, even though we're developing on the top of a base system, it's recognizing that the existing power system was developed for a very different purpose. It was developed to integrate in large-scale fossil units, or in some countries like the US and Asia, nuclear units. Now we're developing it for renewables, and we have to think about it differently. And so what we recognize is that if you don't do it that way, right? People come in and they put on their lovely solar plants and wind farms, and they find out the system is highly congested and they can't use it. And then that creates a certainly risk. The other piece is, of course, as we're building out the system, we want to de-risk it as much as possible. We want to create certainty because these are big capital investments. And the last thing you want to do is put money into a big capital investment and find out it doesn't work. And so we need, as power system operators, designers, owners, really think about this in a way of how do you commercialize these resources at the lowest possible risk. And the best way to do that is to build it out, very much like when you think about it, many of our countries built out interstate highway systems in the past to make sure that we were there as the communities were building up so that we can make it easier for people. And that's really what we're doing here.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate your insights. Let's move to our next speaker. Our next speaker comes from Singapore. We have Dr. Jing Tao, Principal Metrologist from the Agency for Science, Technology and Research, or A*STAR. Dr. Jing, I turn the floor to you. You're on mute, Doctor.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you much for the introduction and kind of invitation for me to share here at this round table. Hello, everyone. My topic will be on the metrology consideration for a proposed cross-border power integration. Next, please. And if we see the statistics, we can find that in the ASEAN region, the main sources for the power is fossil fuels, especially we still use 30% cruise for power, compared with something like 2% in the UK. So if we consider the carbon emission target, this is too far away for us to achieve. We have to actually to reduce to something like 30% by the fossil fuels. If you refer to this table, we can see that actually the renewable sources in the ASEAN region is rich enough compared with the current demand of power. And as mentioned by other speakers before, by Matthew as well as Ms. Sipman, actually to share such resources, we have to transmit them in the electricity form through the grids. So that's why cross-border transmission grids is really necessary to make the full use of such resources efficiently. Next, please. So for so that the ACE as well as the UNESCAP put such an prospect for this region for 2035. It proposes that around 40 gigawatts to be traded among the members of the ASEAN region. You can see that actually this trading, the flow of the energy is at both directions, not necessarily one direction. But this way, we'll share the peak values of energy and simultaneously to use the possible achieved energy by the industry. And Matthew just mentioned that at this moment, we should consider how to plan and to get the finance, as well as to develop the infrastructure and to plan for the trading and operation. Next, please. So for such a great blueprint, we have to consider what will be the technical challenge to be prepared to achieve this target. I'm glad that Ms. Zipman just mentioned that for such a grid, you have to consider, for instance, machine learning, as well as IoT, and together for the technical challenge, we have to see actually, first of all, if the current sensors accuracy is enough for such a cross-border connection, as well as the robustness of the sensors. And such sensors is not only to see where to put them, but what quality of them. We have to consider such things. And so for simultaneous data acquisition and transmission among the nations, among the grid companies. And also what we need, because there are a lot amount of data, we need a large grid simulation and analyze abilities for comprehensive condition monitoring, and also predict any action such as a mountainous on switch off, switch on, such actions to ensure the grid resilience and prevent outage. Therefore, if we consider the operational platform for such integrated grids, the platform should be able to perform real-time analysis and speedy response, and it should also be able to monitor the dynamic system status and predict maintenance if needed. Another thing is that the system should be, the metering in the system should be traceable to the SI units. And just, Marshall just mentioned that for such a connection of the grid, we have to build up trust, political trust, as well as business consensus. So actually, when we see the traceability to SI units, so this is most of the basic things, technical preparations to build up such trust. And of course, if we have this such infrastructure to build up such trust, of course, we have to improve our regulatory frameworks because this will cover the area cross-border. Next, please. So, and for the metrology consideration, we have to see that we have to see a big picture about the metrology strategy combined with IoT, information communication technology, as well as big data, and also as Superman mentioned, the machine learning techniques. So for the observation as well as for the control of the interconnected grid. And also we have to consider what measurement framework we can apply for such a system. I would say mostly the conception based on the phase measurement units. We use this. This is a category of measurement system. The special point of this system is that when it takes data in the system, for instance, the voltage, current, phase, power quality, all those systems, simultaneously, it will have a timestamp for each data. So the time comes from the GPS. And we need to consider such a system, and the system can simultaneously transfer to a center for data processor, also for decision making. Next, please. Then we come to the consider what measurement units we have to consider. The first of all, I think for such to maintain such a system, a big system, we have to consider what loss measurement we can make, because for the integrated transmission systems, the health status of the system really depending on the insulation level of the system. So the loss measurement is a direct indication of the electrical insulation status of the system. So we have to consider what method we are going to apply, and such method, developed sensors to install at what positions and what locations. And if we have properly designed such installation, then we can immediately localize any disturbance so that we can take necessary action to ensure the efficiency as well as the stability of the grid. And also to build up the trust as well as the consensus, we have to improve the measurement accuracy of both high voltage and high current. Not necessarily as what normally we do calibration in lab for low voltage devices. We have to also to consider how to ensure to maintain the accuracies of the transducers installed at the grid network in different locations in different countries. So this is not only for the fair trading, not only for the trust, but also for the process control of the system. And another thing is that we have to find a way to determine the power quality in such an interconnected system and its propagation along the connection to assess their effect, then to develop measures to suppress their effect, again, to ensure the stability of the grid. And another important task for metrologists is to develop methods to verify and to calibrate such sensors, meters along the system. Because normally traditionally, after some sensors on transducer installed in the system, normally you do not do calibration. But for management of a bigger network, you have to ensure the accuracy so that to ensure the quality of the data. So we have to think how to do calibration of such things like a remote calibration, on-site calibration, on mutual check of the health status and so on. Next, please. And so this comes to the so-called data quality. So formally, we consider it as a calibration of instrument, but not because of the big amount of data transmission and analyze. We have to consider what would be the measures to ensure the quality of data during the process and also during the decision making. And so this is some more task for the metrologists to consider. Next, please. That's all for my rough sharing with all about the technical challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jing, for the remarks. You touched on a number of themes that overlap quite nicely with the things that Audrey mentioned in her presentation, in particular on data and the need to really rethink the data needs of a system that's running more on renewables. Hopefully we can come back and discuss that more during the discussion section. Let me now turn to
Matt, you've gone on mute.
Yes.
I've been muted this whole time. My apologies. Sorry, Dr. Jing, thank you so much for your remarks. I was just saying I want to come back to this this question of data more when we come to the discussion section. But now let me turn to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Tarinya Supasa, Senior Analyst and Senior Officer of Modeling Policy and Planning at the ASEAN Center for Energy. Dr. Supasa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity for sharing our upcoming publication, the 6th ASEAN Energy Outlook today. And yeah, thank you very much for the UNESCAP for inviting ASEAN Center for Energy, or ACE, to share and to join the UNESCAP think tank roundtable in SIEW. Next, please. Yeah, so for this year, so there's 2 important flagship documents which will be launched and endorsed in the 38th ASEAN Minister of Energy meeting next month in Vietnam. So the first one is this Outlook, the 6th version of Energy Outlook, and the second one is the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, Phase 2, which will cover 2021 to 2025. And under this APAEC document, discovered like the 7 program of energy development in ASEAN. So this data and analysis from the 6th ASEAN Energy Outlook is kind of the complement to support the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, and also support the creation pathway for achieving and the regional target for the next 5 years. Next, please. So there are 4 scenarios that we are developed under this Outlook version. So the first one is the baseline scenario, which is assume there's more effort on energy efficiency and renewable energy, but still incorporate the most updated power development plan in this scenario. And the second one is we call the AMS, or the ASEAN Member State Target Scenario, which incorporate the most updated energy efficiency, renewable energy, and also for the power development plan and NDC official target of our 10 ASEAN member states into the model. And the third one is APAEC target scenario, or is claimed that the regional target scenario, which is scaling up the efforts in efficiency, renewable energy in end-use sector, and also accelerate more renewable energy in the power sector, And this evaluation depends on the country potential, the current feasibility, and also for the resource assessment consult together with our the other ACE project, which is mentioned before by Singapore colleagues, is core AIMS 3 or the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan. And for the last scenario, this is the SDG 7. So this scenario is to ensure that ASEAN's ongoing or the future practice will be in line with the global level commitment, and also identify the gap and how ASEAN can fulfill that gap. Next, please. Yeah, so there are four main parts or the four main components that will be elaborated in this outlook. So the first one is the breakout. So we will show the reader like how AO or this outlook will support the future pathway of ASEAN, and also on the regional target and aspirations, and also the role of APAEC or the ASEAN plan, ASEAN of action for anti-cooperation to address or the challenge in energy security, accessibility, affordability, and sustainability. And this version of Outlook already consolidate the impact of the COVID-19 to the GDP recession and how that recession will impact to the energy demands in future. And the second part is scenario, result, and implication, which is the main part of this outlook. So the philosophy behind the development of this outlook is present, and also the data and their official target, and as well as the result we show in energy landscape, emissions projection, and also socio-economics result like investment, externality cost, and also for the job creations. And the third part is kind of the extended idea of the second scenario, because we are aware that the technology is changed so fast. And also it's mean like the official target or the information that we collected from the ASEAN member state probably could be changed in the next 5 or 6 months or next year. So we also arrange this section we call thematic energy insight, extended more deeper dive idea into this particular 5 highlight topic. The first one is the ASEAN power grid, and also the second one is the role of fossil fuel in future, efficient air condition, which is possible to implement in ASEAN, the greener transport like the electric vehicle situation, and also for the biofuel policy, and the last one is clean cooking. And this thematic insight, you will able to find more or deeper detail in, especially in the grid power sector, which is try to incorporate the global perspective and try to see how the other regions work on this APG, on the power grid integration topics. And the last one is a recommendation and implication, like including policy recommendation, institutional, and also for the future outlook development. Next, please. Yeah, so this figure present the electricity demand projection. Then you will see the comparison between the projection of baseline ASEAN target scenario and the APAEC target scenario or the regional target scenario. So even for these, the most stringent energy efficiency scenario in the APS, so the electricity demand is showing likely more than 2 times in 2040. So in those 3 scenarios, is showing like the surge or the rapid growth of electricity demand can be seen in ASEAN regions. And the most dominated sector is tend to be industrial sector, following by commercial and the residential sector. Next, please. Yeah, and then this outlook together with, because we have the consultation process to consult with the 10 ASEAN member states on their most updated power development plan, and also lines with our AIMS 3 project in ACE. So this is kind of the list for the most power development plan that we present in this outlook. and yeah, through different process. So it shows like the growth of managing costs and externality from the power production is very essential challenge in ASEAN. And it seems like the ASEAN power grid will play more crucial roles in the context and opening the new opportunity for the clean and cleaner generation. And also it's a good option for the ASEAN member state to decreasing their overall power system. Next, please. Yeah, this figure is reference from the power development plan that we just showed in the last slide. And it's showing the electricity import and export referred to the PDP selected year in 2025. So we can project to see, like comparing to 2017 level, the electricity for import and export or the interconnection or the power trade is projected to increase around 1.7 times. So the majority or more than 90% of this import and export is come from our like neighbor country, which Thailand is Laos PDR country, and partially is come from like outside the region, which is China. And yeah, so this increasing of the interconnection power trade can be seen the growth trend in ASEAN, and this come with the package of like more awareness or the more urgent, like ASEAN likely to have the discussion for the interconnection discussion. Okay, next please. Yeah, and this figure is showing the installed capacity projection based on the PDP under the ASEAN target scenario on your left-hand side. So it could be seen like solar, hydro, and RE, and also including like the fossil fuel capacity is likely to be increased over the next 5 years, 2021 to 2025. However, on the right-hand side is showing like in order for ASEAN to achieve the regional target on renewable energy, like 23% in 2025. So there is more urgent needs to inject more renewable energy, especially for solar, and have to try to reduce some of the fossil fuel capacity in the overall system. So this, the decision for injected more solar or wind is come from the resource assessment tools where lines with our AIM3 projects together with this outlook. Next, please. Yeah, and this showing the decarbonization transition trend on the power sector in ASEAN. So the figure on the 2025 years on the ASEAN target scenario is showing likely in ASEAN will have like 33% of renewable energy injected in the regional system. However, if the region would like to achieve the 23% of the regional target as committed by 10 countries, so the RE needs to be injected more or scaling up from 33% to 48%. So that's the notable increase of solar that can be seen, and also reducing the fossil fuel-based power plant as mentioned previously. And this increasing more RE into the system, which is need the discussion more on the how the grid quality can be sustained by incorporate like the new power technology, for example, like grid storage or digitalization to manage the grid to sustain the reliability of the grid quality. Next, please. Yeah, and I think that's end of my presentation. And for the full report of this 6th ASEAN Energy Outlook, it can be filed after launching officially in the AMEM next month. So yeah, before I end my presentation, I also would like to thank you, GIZ, for support in this Outlook development as well. Thank you very much. Matt, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Supasa, for those helpful and interesting remarks. I talked at the very beginning about the need for more regional master plans, and to develop those plans, you really need to have a common vision of a possible future for your region. And I think this is exactly what AEO6 provides. It provides that common vision, that common potential pathways that the rest of the ASEAN member states can then build off of. And AIM3 acts as that master plan as well. So I think really you're doing a lot of great work in the region. And also this acts as a really useful and helpful introduction or a bridge to the next presentation. My good friend Pirapat from the International Energy Agency. Pirapat leads the IEA's analysis on challenges and best practices in integrating renewable energy into power systems. And he's going to talk a bit about power trading and renewables integration in the ASEAN context. Pirapat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, UNESCAP, for the invitations to speak today to join the panel discussions. So I'm going to talk about the role of cross-border interconnections in facilitating the integrations of renewables in ASEAN. This is based on the study that we delivered last year to the Next slide, please. So as mentioned by Mr. Lee and also Mr. Sibelman, Ms. Sibelman from AMO, that grid is one of the main options in facilitating the growing share of renewables from both the operational aspects as well as the economic aspects. So this work is to look at the role of how the cross-border interconnection in ASEAN can help to integrate more renewables. So we conduct a study to looking at different share of renewables and then the different trading arrangement in terms of bilateral trade arrangement and multilateral trade. How is it going to help to integrate more renewables? This is based on the hourly dispatch modeling in 2035. So we refer to the scenarios from the previous ASEAN Energy Outlook, which was published a couple of years ago. So we look at the 4 regions in ASEAN from central, which consists of Thailand, northwest, Myanmar, and then east consists of Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam, and the southern area consisting of Malaysia and Singapore. So we're going to highlight the various operational, economic, and policy-related considerations, as well as from the environmental aspect as well. Next, please. So we look at the cross-border interconnections as planned by the previous, again, the ASEAN Interconnection Master Plan Phase 2, which was done several years ago. So we took those scenarios and then we refer to that in terms of what are the plans for interconnection between different countries in ASEAN. Next, please. Next. So from the baseline renewable scenarios, which we look at the 10% variable renewables, we can see that the bilateral trade, the cost of bilateral trade in terms of operational cost is around $20 per megawatt hour. But then by moving from the bilateral trade to the multilateral trades with the same existing cross-border infrastructure, the operational cost can be reduced by around $1 per megawatt hour, but that's equivalent to around $1 billion for the cost of the operational for the ASEAN system. And then by expanding transmission interconnections between these countries, then the further cost can be reduced by up to around $5 per megawatt hour, which is equivalent to $5 billion. But of course, expanding interconnections with the current level of renewables around 10%, according to the plan, it will bring it will create more emissions because it's allow lower cost, which is consists mostly of coal and gas to generate more. So that can result in more emissions. But then if we move to the right-hand side graph, we look at the case with 25% renewables. Multilateral trade and expanded cross-border interconnections not only bring the economic benefits in terms of operational cost savings, but also reducing the CO2 emissions, because the cross-border interconnectors allowing different countries to share the resources, particularly the renewables resources, which there's a lot of potential renewables in ASEAN regions, particularly the hydro in, for example, in Myanmar and also in Laos. So cross-border interconnections allow these resources to be shared to the countries with growing demand, for example, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. Next, please. Multilateral trade and expanded transmissions in ASEAN will enable greater trade between different regions in ASEAN. As shown in this graph, we can see that the bilateral trade based on the existing infrastructure will have the power flow of around 30 terawatt-hour per year. But then if you move from the bilateral trade to the multilateral trade, it can increase the power flow by almost from 30 to around 50 terawatt-hour. But then if we expand it, interconnections by introducing new interconnectors, by investing in more interconnectors, it will enable more power flow in the case of high renewable penetration scenarios. Interconnectors will also help to integrate more renewables by reducing the curtailments, as we can see on the right-hand side graph. With the bilateral trade, and if we have the high amount of renewables, around 25%, then it will cause a lot of curtailment because there's a limited trading between different countries. Although there's infrastructure, but then the bilateral trade arrangement will limit the trade. But then moving from to multilateral trade, it can reduce the amount of curtailment. And if you expand interconnections between these countries, will allow more renewable to be integrated by reducing the curtailment to around less than 3%. Next, please. This figure is based on the report that we have just launched on Tuesday as part of the system integrations of renewable ministerial meeting, which was held at SIEW on Tuesday. So this graph shows the contributions of different technologies in providing energy, peak capacity, and also flexibility and stability services based on the ASEAN case study that we did. So this report consisting of the three key aspects, which are the energy transitions with growing share of renewables, cyber resilience, and extreme weather events. This aspect has been mentioned by Audrey Sibelman in her speech as well, that it's going to play a critical role in the coming years. So this, in 2018, we can see that the contributions, most of the contribution is come from thermal power plants, which consist of coal and gas in providing energy as well as providing the peaking capacity. And in terms of flexibility and stability, a thermal power plant is still, has a main role to play. In terms of flexibility, we determine this by the ramping service that different technology can provide. So we can see that in 2018, most of these come from thermal power plant. But when we move into 2035 with the high share of renewables, then we can see the contributions from other technology, particularly the hydropower plant and also storage, and of course, variable renewables in contributing to the power system in providing not only energy and peaking capacity, but also flexibility and also stability in order to accommodate this growing share of variable renewables. Next, please. So I just want to highlight in terms of the benefits of regional connectivity, particularly in ASEAN, based on our study, that the multilateral trade, electricity, as well as the expanded cross-border interconnections are powerful instruments that should be considered because it will help to accommodate the growing share of renewables, which we are expecting in ASEAN in the coming years. So without any new interconnections, based on what I have shown so far, the optimizing cross-border power flows based on existing infrastructure, it can help to accommodate the growing share of renewables in a way that it lower operating costs of the system as a whole from the ASEAN perspective. And by expanding more cross-border interconnections together with the multilateral trade, this can help to integrate more renewables and reduce the operational costs. So with the upcoming AEO6 that's going to be launched, as mentioned by Dr. Tarinya, as well as the new AIM3 study, phase 3, that's going to be launched as well. We're going to look into adopting the scenarios from those two studies and then to develop our study further in terms of how that's going to help in terms of integrated more renewables into the system in a cost-effective and reliable manners. Thanks very much. Next, please.
Great, thank you, Kun Pirapat, for that really useful presentation. I think you highlighted a number of elements that I think touch on all the themes that we've been discussing so far. For example, this when it comes to connectivity, there's a number of different pieces that need to be considered: infrastructure, trading regime, and the generation mix. And you can't ignore any of those when you want to talk about the ability for connectivity to support more sustainable and resilient power system development. So it's really useful to see some of the trade-offs that happen if you move too quickly in one area and not enough in others. With that, let me move now to our next speaker. Our next speaker comes from the Asian Development Bank, Jiwan Acharya, Senior Energy Specialist in the South Asia Department. Jiwan, I turn the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending on where you are. First of all, I would like to thank UNESCAP for inviting me to share our ADB's perspectives on this regional cooperation and integration in Asia. And this is also a very, very high priority for ADB. If you look at our strategy 2030 and also our country partnership strategies, this aspect has been given due focus as we prepare our programs and activities in each of these countries. ADB has also been actively supporting our developing member countries through our Greater Mekong Sub-Region Program, GMS, for ASEAN countries. And we also have a CAREC program for Central Asian countries. And we also have our support for our SAARC, South Asia, and also our South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation programs. In this presentation, please allow me to focus on the South Asia aspect of it, because we have also already heard a lot about in ASEAN countries, and my other colleagues will also talk about other regions. Since I am personally very much involved in the South Asia, and I also work in our South Asia Energy Division of ADB, please let me focus more on the South Asia aspect of it. If you look at South Asia, as you know, we have a very large country like India and Bangladesh, but we also have smaller countries like Bhutan and Maldives in our region, and then Nepal and also Sri Lanka are also there. So we can see that there is a wide variety of generation sources across this sub-region. There is a dominance of single energy source for power generation in most of these member countries. Cost of generation and supply widely varies across the South Asian nations, with countries like Nepal and Bhutan having access to cheap hydropower and India having access to abundant renewable energy. And these countries also have time peak and off peak and seasonal complementarities, which may be leveraged through regional cooperation. There is also a very high scope for channelizing revenue from power export for socio-economic development. And there is a scope for reducing carbon footprint, increasing renewable energy penetration, opportunity to support fluctuations from renewable energy with traditional sources. So with the specific feature of this South Asia, well, we all can agree that there is a need for a regional framework agreement to develop energy resources, meeting electricity demand, and enhanced economic benefits for this region. But as in many other regions, there are, of course, barriers and challenges for implementation of this kind of agreement for cross-border electricity trade. I can see that there are at least 5 areas where there are barriers and challenges. One is, of course, in the technical challenges. There's a lack of harmonization of technical regulation, transmission access, and planning. On the commercial challenges, these are related to limited competitive pricing regime for cross-border trade, no uniform transmission pricing framework. On the system operations issue, there is a lack of common operational guidelines, congestion management, energy accounting settlement. On the institutional challenges, there is a multiple decision-making layers, lack of member nation focal point integrated in organization structure. And of course, there is also challenges related to regional power exchange itself. So lack of clear roadmap and lack of open access regulation across member states. I mean, we cannot just keep on talking about these issues and challenges, but we need to address those issues and challenges, working together with all the countries and also all other development partners. But there have been also some very good progress that have happened in this region. One notable one is that our SAARC framework agreement for energy cooperation electricity was signed in 2014 at the 18th SAARC meeting. And then, of course, these member states are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So this is a kind of a very important milestone for this electricity cooperation, energy cooperation in the region. And then this framework agreement has already been ratified by all member countries, and then we hope that Pakistan is the only one remaining and will do that one soon. After that, there are several multilateral and trilateral trade are at different stages of happening in the region. So now let me turn into what ADB is doing in all of these things. In fact, ADB has been working and supporting these member countries in this region all the way back in 2005. We had, we helped prepare this regional trade cooperation agreement, some support, roadmap for harmonization of legal and regulatory framework, alternative financing mechanism for regional projects that also started back in 2005 to 2010. In 2011 and 2013, we also did some studies on South Asia regional power exchange. That's where we looked at some of the, interconnection possibilities and also some kind of a market rules for regional power trade and exchange, and also provided some recommendations for regulatory framework compatibility. From 2014 to 2017 and 18, we also helped develop this cross-border electricity transmission master plan, and also keeping in mind of this renewable energy and also conventional energy and how that will help promote this regional energy cooperation. Of course, these are more on the soft side of it, which are very, very important, but ADB being a financial institution, and we are also financing various projects. And then whenever we receive any request for projects which have interconnection opportunities with another country, we really prioritize that one. And in fact, we have already financed various projects. And just to give an example, we have also financed the Gachu and Nigachu hydropower project in Bhutan. And then the power is exported to India. And we have also financed India-Bangladesh interconnections. And there is a lot of power being imported from that transmission lines also. I mean, these are just a few examples. There are others being discussed with Nepal and India, and also we're looking at opportunities in other areas. I do want to emphasize that the role of regulators is very, very important when we are talking about this energy trade, cross-border energy trade. And ADB has also been supporting SAARC Council of Experts of Energy Regulators on various regulatory coordination issues related to implementation of SAARC Energy Framework. I also want to mention here is that there is also this South Asia sub-regional economic cooperation, and then there is also the member countries have also created a power trade working group, and ADB is facilitating that group through bringing them together and then having a discussion on various aspects of it, and also providing support if they want to do some further studies, identifying some projects, also help develop those projects, mobilizing funds for those projects, and also if there are any capacity building related activities, then we also providing support for that one. And we also maintain and update our SASET priority projects. We also have ongoing regional technical assistance projects to support our SASEC member countries in enhancing this power trade in the region. Again, this is all depends on what kind of requests that we receive from our member countries related to, again, for the projects development, financing, and also on capacity building. What we also feel is that, there's a lot of preparatory work has to be done before any investments can come in. So this is where these countries coming together, discussing and agreeing on resolving some of these issues are very important. And then ADB has been providing significant support in this area. And then we would like to also continue doing that one and work very closely with our other member countries. Moving forward, what I want to mention is that now it's very, very essential that we should be transitioning from bilateral to trilateral and also to a multilateral cross-border energy trade. Of course, we do need to recognize the bilateral relationship ongoing right now, but I think we need to move on into multilateral, some kind of arrangement in South Asia region. And then, of course, this cross-border electricity trade leads to clean energy transition and sustainability and climate change mitigation. This is also very, very important, as we all know. And, this also need to look at focus on the power market development, including ancillary services and so on. And of course, when we are talking about any cross-border thing, there's a lot of investments requirements will be there, and then any investments comes with risk. So how do we de-risk those cross-border electricity infrastructure projects, and also enhance the bankability of those project investment mobilization? And we need to continue supporting the process of policy and regulatory harmonization and institutional capacity. And there, what we believe is that if you move along these lines, I think there is a tremendous opportunities for the cross-border electricity trade in South Asia and also in other regions. And then I think by working together in that direction, everybody wins. And ADB being a development partner in this region, we remain committed to provide our financing and also our technical assistance and also the grant support for our projects. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to share, and I'll be happy to take some questions and then explain that further. Back to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiwon. Really appreciate the remarks. Let's turn to our final speaker for this panel session before we get to the discussion. Next, we have David Morgado. David is Senior Energy Specialist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. Senior Energy Policy Specialist, my apologies. David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, and it's a real pleasure to be here at the Singapore International Energy Week, and thank you again for UNESCAP for the invitation to be here and the panel discussion. My presentation is about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and how connectivity and sustainable connectivity is very much at the core of the establishment of the bank. Maybe next slide, and then the one after that. Yeah, so this is perfect. Thank you. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a newly established multilateral development bank, but we focus specifically on one area, it's infrastructure. And so unlike the Asian Development Bank or World Bank, which have a broader sort of mandate, poverty mandate, we are specifically focusing on infrastructure, but we want to focus on high quality infrastructure, including electricity transmission and distribution. And the reason the bank was established almost 5 years ago was because there's a huge infrastructure gap. And there's not enough funding from governments, from bilateral, multilateral institutions. And so there was a need to bring another multilateral development bank to accelerate and address this huge infrastructure funding gap. And our mission is financing infrastructure for tomorrow. And there is, we don't want to be doing the same infrastructure that we've been doing in the past. We want to do sustainable infrastructure. We want to unlock new capital. We want to introduce new technologies, a bit like we've been talking about today, and sort of looking at ways of addressing climate change and connecting Asia much better than we have today. The core values of the bank are lean, clean, and green. So it's a very catchy phrase. Green being we want to promote projects that have some elements of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and also other environmental benefits. Next slide, please. So the bank started in 2016 with 57 founding members. We have ramped up very quickly in just 5 years to 103 approved members. And we can work in any of these countries, whether they're developed or developing countries. And I think that's an important consideration when we're looking at cross-border connectivity. So we can work with all these countries, we can engage with them, we can look at projects linking those countries, whether they're developed or developing countries. And that's one area that we've been looking at very much with UNESCAP and other partners in Northeast Asia, and how to connect, for example, Korea, Japan, together with Russia, China, and other countries as well. Next slide, please. So any project that the bank finances has to be aligned with at least one of these, what we call thematic priorities. And the first one, as I mentioned, green infrastructure. So again, climate change mitigation, adaptation, environmental benefits, very much aligned with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement. And I think here we particularly on power transmission distribution, we want to look at how can we make the transmission distribution projects more resilient to climate change, to adapt to extreme weather patterns, as was mentioned by Audrey, as well in terms of fires and so on. So it's something that we really want to consider now when we're looking at projects. And we do try to add that element in those projects. As I mentioned, connectivity and regional cooperation is very much at the core and of the establishment of the bank. So we want to facilitate a better energy connectivity across Asia and between Asia as well. And we're not only talking about connectivity cross-border, but also connectivity within the countries. And that's, I think, critical. And I think a lot of the colleagues here talked about that. So we can't just focus on the cross-border element of it. We need to invest, of course, in renewable energy, but also within strengthening the transmission distribution within the country. We wanted to look at technology-enabled infrastructure. We want to look at 21st century technologies, whether it's digitalization, but we don't want to only look at design elements. We also want to look at what can we add in terms of our operation and maintenance, whether it's using drones for looking at maintenance of transmission and distribution. So or even high voltage direct current. So we definitely want to, if we're investing in infrastructure, we want to make sure it's technology enabled and state of the art, particularly suited to manage an increasing variable renewable energy. And then finally, because a lot of this investment needs private capital, and so we are very keen and we very much support and invest to get private capital mobilized. So the bank Similarly to the ADB, we can support both sovereign, what we call public sector, but also private sector projects. And I think with the current COVID situation, there will be a need very much to bring in private capital for transmission and distribution as well within the countries particularly. Next slide, please. So to make sure it's not only words, we have targets established in our corporate strategy to look at cross-border connectivity. So we need to make sure that projects that we do, a certain percentage by 2030 is represented there, because that's why the bank was established. But we also want to look at climate finance. So we have a 50% climate financing by 2025, which is quite ambitious. So again, because a lot of the projects that are coming in on the energy sector are transmission and distribution, we need to make sure that they are either improving efficiency, they're connecting renewable energy, or they are also adapted to increasing climate change as well. Next slide, please. I think this slide is just to highlight sort of the many energy challenges that we face today. And I think a lot of the colleagues here sort of presented, there's still a lot of people without access to electricity, a significant amount of people also without access to clean cooking facilities. And I think in the bank's view, natural gas still can play a very important role there. And we have been supporting gas transmission distribution across countries, and I'll talk a bit about that. But we also see in the future many issues as well where there's an incredible energy growth. There is a number of people starting to live in cities, in urban areas, and there's an increasing need for investment, quite significant investment in electricity systems as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of the energy strategy, which sort of guides the bank in terms of its investments, we really want to support countries to develop and improve their energy infrastructure. We want to support them in increasing their energy access. So there's a number of countries like Myanmar, even Cambodia and others where Bangladesh, where there is a need for increased energy access. And it's not only in quantity, but also in terms of quality. So people are expecting to have energy access toward it 24/7. To help countries also transition to the low carbon energy mix. And so we see a role for renewable energy and natural gas as well in the next coming years. And also helping countries meet their international commitments as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Energy for All. Next slide, please. So just to highlight very briefly that the bank was just established 5 years ago, but we have managed to, on average, invest in about 1 gigawatt per year of renewable energy capacity, which is quite remarkable in my view. But we've also been investing in significant transmission distribution lines and pipelines within countries and cross countries in a total of almost 11,000 kilometers, and that will continue to grow. We have an incredible pipeline of transmission and distribution projects coming along in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. This slide is just to highlight the areas that we have been investing. The gas transmission and distribution, I'd highlight the Trans-Anatolian Natural Gas Pipeline project, which will be in my next slide, which I'll talk about. But in electricity transmission and distribution, we have been supporting countries like Bangladesh, India, and even Nepal in strengthening their energy systems. Need to be ready to cope with increasing renewable energy, but also eventually for export as well. And I think it's very important to mention that we've also been investing in renewable energy projects, and in some countries very much focused on export trajectories of these countries in the long term. So like Tajikistan and Nepal, we have been investing with other multilateral development banks in these projects so that the countries can export this low-cost renewable energy to other neighboring countries such as Bangladesh and also to Pakistan and others. Next slide, please. I'd like to highlight, I know that we've been talking mostly about power transmission and distribution. This slide is just to highlight the Trans-Anatolian natural gas pipeline, which we've invested in together with other multilateral development banks. And AIB committed a total of $600 million to finance about half of the 3,500 kilometer pipeline. And this pipeline links basically Azerbaijan to Turkey and then to Europe. And it's mainly gas for meeting heating needs. So it's not so much for power generation. And because there is still quite a significant demand for heating purposes in Central Asia, in China. And so gas at the moment is still a very much viable and critical element of the energy access in these countries. And so it's so important for many countries in Central Asia to be able to export to their neighboring countries and also as a source of revenue. And with that, I'll stop here. So very much looking forward to the discussions and questions. Thank you.
David, thank you so much for that presentation. Actually, thank you to all of our presenters today. I think we really heard quite a lot of really useful and relevant information, and definitely, I think, hopefully you'll come away with a great understanding of why we see connectivity as mattering across multiple dimensions. Now let's turn to our discussion. We are down to a bit less than half an hour, so hopefully we'll have time to give everyone a chance to speak. We have also received a number of really great questions from the audience. So I might go ahead and just start by bringing in some of the questions. So just to begin, and perhaps I'll aim this question at Audrey and Dr. Jing. One of the questions we received is, what are the key technology enablers for grid infrastructure that could be game changers in terms of trans-border trading? And then I want to also bring in the topic you both raised on the data question. You both presented on how the data needs in these systems are going to be really critical. And there's a lot of technology infrastructure that needs to support that data flow. It also raises maybe some security questions about data. So perhaps, Audrey, maybe we can start with you. Could you talk a little bit about the technology side beyond just transmission? Where do you see some of the innovations happening to support more of this connectivity work?
So thank you. I think, am I on?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. So some of the things that we're looking at are certainly things like grid forming inverters, or the intelligence in the inverters themselves, so that we could see that, because one of the aspects of when you have lots of renewables is the ability of the renewables to be resilient to disturbances. And also we're also looking at batteries. Obviously, storage technologies will be very important as we move forward, but also thinking in terms of how can you use batteries to provide inertia and fast frequency and innovations in terms of that. Certainly DC technology and VSCs and those types of resources will be important. But on the data side, I think it is going to be around AI. It'll be around machine learning. And I think also in terms of simulation, and the need to be able to look at much more information and do all the what ifs. One of the greatest complexities around when you have renewables in combination, both on the grid and at the rooftop, is the amount of optimization that you need to do, but the amount of series of events that you need to be able to model and make a determination as to making sure that you have sufficient resources that are there. So anything we can do to share data and think about, too, creating the capabilities to look at a single point of truth, because when you have multiple grid operators in different countries now going to be relying on these resources, and everyone has a different view of what the output's going to be, that's going to create a bit of chaos. So we need to be able to share the information. When we say share data, it's be able to see it, because now what's happening, you think about it, fuel in this power industry used to be considered a fairly proprietary resource. Everybody knew how much inventory they had for gas and how much inventory they had for coal. Fuel now is the weather, it's the real-time climate conditions, and it has to be something that could be shared across the systems so that everybody understands and can anticipate and therefore maintain local reserves based on seeing that single point and having that information. So I love the idea of the multilateral conditions, and then thinking about how you create the market environments so that we can share these resources efficiently. But that is going to be requiring sharing information and making sure that for various critical pieces of the system, there is that single view of what is going to happen. So because as power system operators, we always have to anticipate those next events and make sure we're ready for them.
Great, thank you. Dr. Jing, maybe you can also chime in on this topic.
From the technology side, I would think for the bigger integration of grids, different challenges really arise. First of all, we need instant monitoring of the conditions at different points. Let's say for the circuit, we use different nodes to monitor the energy flow, to monitor the dynamic balance of the system. So it's not a small connection, it's a long distance cross-border with different regulatory definitions. The total measurement system have to be reconsidered, which should be agreed with different authorities and different companies. So also, I agree with all of you, and it's related to data now, because it's a big network and you have too much data. Your simulation system much big enough to find what data are useful and what data you collect and drop it away. And another thing is that the scientists have to prepare the technology for such a big blueprint, a big strategy to ensure the precise running of the sensors, not only the grid itself. The grid itself, we would say, is depending on the manufacturers, depending on the industry. But for the running of such a system, we need this sensor system to monitor the status and to precisely use the data, to precisely predict the status, to precisely make a decision. We need the accuracy of the data. It's not only the accuracy when we install the instrument, but also during the operation, we need to ensure the accuracy of all the sensors of the whole measurement system. And also the accuracy after we collect the data, during the transmission of the data, process of the data, use the data to make a decision. All those things scientists should consider. So that's why I want to highlight here in such a forum. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think you both really hit on some really important points. Audrey, I really liked that statement you had about the need for a single point of truth. I think perhaps we could use in general in our lives these days. And this also that relates, I think, to the point Dr. Jing brought up about which data is actually relevant and which data we actually need to throw away. Not all data points have equal weight, right? Some data is valuable and some data might actually be pushing us in the wrong direction because perhaps the data is wrong, or perhaps it simply isn't actually what we need to be focusing our attention on. So those are really useful ways of considering this question. Let me turn now to perhaps Dr. Supasa, who talked about the ASEAN context a little bit and the future for ASEAN. I wanted to ask, and maybe also Pirpat, perhaps this is also a good question for you to chime in on. The question of, and really it's also maybe the single point of truth. So there's different visions for how ASEAN may move forward. And I think what you both highlighted is under different scenarios, you can have very different outcomes. You know, we do expect obviously significant demand growth in ASEAN. Yeah, you mentioned, Dr. Supasa, that even under the high energy efficiency scenario, demand growth will more than double over the next 20 years or so. But there's a big difference between a doubling of demand and a tripling of demand, for example, or a big difference between one country moving very rapidly in renewables and one country perhaps moving more slowly. So one question for you is, how do we really kind of create this common vision? How did you, when developing the AE06, come to this sort of common vision for ASEAN? And what lessons might you have for other regions who are maybe at earlier stages in joint planning and are thinking about how to create this common blueprint for moving forward? Dr. Supasa, perhaps if you would mind taking that question on.
Yes, thank you, Matt. I think in the view of our ASEAN Center for Energy, so we, as shown in my presentation, so we saw kind of the way in medium term like forward for the ASEAN member to consider more about the interconnection power to serve their increasing demand. So it seems like most of the country in ASEAN currently, so they also consider more about how they can increase the bilateral or multilateral agreement with their neighboring country to import more about electricity instead of, you know, try to build more the installed capacity domestically. So that lead to the urgent needs for probably bring the discussion or the more like agreement in terms of political and also for the technical, like serve how the ASEAN can move forward together in terms of capacity building in infrastructure and also in terms of the technical knowledge or the technical like experience to serve this growth of the interconnections or the power trade in near future. And it's not going to be that long, like 10 years. It's going to be very sooner than we thought. Like in next, like a few years, you've probably seen this kind of discussion will growing like more and more concern, and we'll go to kind of more frequent discussion on this interconnection perspective. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that intervention. And Pirpa, maybe I can turn to you with a similar question. I mean, you with the IEA, obviously you're working with a really wide range of countries. You focused your presentation on ASEAN, but maybe you have insights from other parts of the world as well. But maybe my question for you, just a slight variation on that, is in your presentation, you pointed to the fact that under different scenarios, you might see an increase in emissions or decrease in emissions. And for regions like ASEAN that are looking to make sure that connectivity really supports sustainability, what would you say that countries and regions need to do to make sure that connectivity is aligned with those sustainability goals?
Yep. Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the questions. I think it's relevant to what Dr. Supasa has responded. I think the issue is in terms of like the coordinations between different countries within the regions, because in the past, maybe, you know, particularly 2 or 3 years, we see a growing share of renewables, which is, you know, in some of the countries are higher than expected, although it's still, you know, we are moving towards to achieving the targets from the ASEAN perspective. But then in the next few years, we're going to see the increasing share of renewables, particularly solar PV. The power system in most of the countries in these regions can accommodate such growth. But now the issue is that in terms of there's need to be more, you know, collaboration in terms of sharing resources, because ASEAN has it's the regions that are so rich in terms of potential resources, particularly renewables. You know, the solar, there's no issue about that, and then there's a lot of hydro as well. As I mentioned, you know, in Myanmar and Laos, that's still, you know,
I think we may be having some technical difficulties.
Under development, there's a lot of potential that can be shared to the countries with a high. Okay, can you hear me? Yep. Sorry about that. My connection is having an issue with my connection at the moment, so I'm connecting via a mobile hotspot. As mentioned, I think the role is, you know, for the policymakers to work together so that, you know, these resources in ASEAN can be shared and interconnection is one of the key high penetrations of renewables, which we expect to see in the coming years.
Great, thank you, Pirpat. Really appreciate those thoughts. And let me now turn the last few minutes back to our representatives from ADB and AIIB. David and Jiwon, you know, connectivity projects, especially the infrastructure projects that go across borders, are really complex and they take a lot of time to prepare and implement. So how can AIIB and ADB support countries that are just at the beginning of this process, the early stages of development? Maybe David, I'll start with you, and then Jiwon, if you don't mind chiming in as well.
Thanks, Matt. And that's sort of what we've seen so far, that the cross-border connectivity projects are complex, they're political. They start, I think Jiwon mentioned, they start being bilateral agreements and then eventually become multilateral. It needs eventually also some champions within the countries to move those forward. What the bank offers at the moment is what we call this Project Preparation Special Fund. It's a grant, typically goes from $1 to $2 million. It can go up to $5 million, and it can be given to the government to help prepare these projects, makes them bankable. So this can be used not only to build the capacity awareness within the government, the stakeholders, the regulators, and so on. It can also be used to set up the legal framework. It can be used even for the projects themselves to look at the environmental impact assessments, the design work, and so on, to hiring the consultants and working as well with all the stakeholders to make these projects viable. And so this is something that we can offer to the governments from our member countries. We can engage with them. And the condition is that at the end of this grant, there needs to be a project for us to be able to finance. And so it's very straightforward. The grant is given to the government. The government, it's up to them to manage it, and we can support them in that process.
Thank you, David. Do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with what David mentioned. From ADB side also, we do provide our technical assistance to the countries to help them prepare for the project, and also we'll sometimes often attach technical assistance also during implementation to help them make sure that all the safeguard related issues and also the capacity building issues are also kind of addressed properly. Just one more additional point what I want to mention is that often when we talk about any cross-border project, of course, financing is important. It's very, very important. But from our side, once the project is ready, financing will come in either from here or there. What is important is to make sure that the project is prepared or is ready to receive a financing. So this is where this enabling environment and then the project readiness is very, very important. And then when I talk about project readiness, it means that all the feasibility studies, detailed designs have to be done properly. There has to be all the licenses and approvals from the government have to be in place. There is a power purchase agreement and cross-border, in this case, cross-border agreement has to happen. And there should be institutional mechanism in place. All these tariff-related things has to be sorted out. Regulatory agencies have given their approvals, and also social and environmental clearances, EIA reports, and so on are cleared by the governments. So these are the activities which often take a very long time and requires a lot of financing as well. And then these all have to happen before the financing can come in. So that's why these are the activities. If you can make it happen, then the financing will come in and the project will be ready, and we'll be very happy to finance us by ourselves and also with the IIB, World Bank, and also other multilateral financing institutions. There are also some of their own financing, domestic financing also. So there are a lot of financing sources are available, but what is really important is to make the project ready, and also from the procurement side also, design ready and procurement ready. If you can make that happen, then financing will come in. Thank you.
That's really great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. And we're down to our last few minutes. So maybe I'll just ask one general question for the entire panel. And so anyone who feels like they want to respond, feel free to chime in. We've managed to get through this entire session without once mentioning the COVID-19 pandemic, which I guess someone goes to say, show how much it's been sort of absorbed into our daily lives. But of course, the reason we're not all sitting together in person right now is because of the inability to travel, because of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of the questions that came through also in the online chat, I think relate to this. In your work, in your views, what impacts has COVID had both on some of your short-term plans and also on sort of how you see the long-term evolution of the power system from a sustainability perspective, from an SDG 7 target perspective, or from a reliability perspective? Anyone have anything they want to just sort of say quickly about COVID-19 and how? David, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. It's a very relevant question. Of course, the bank was set up to focus on infrastructure only. And of course, COVID-19 sort of changed that, and the bank has had to adapt to support our many member countries to address their immediate needs. However, we're still focused. Infrastructure needs to go on, needs to be continued to finance. We can't drop it. That'll have another huge impact in the short to medium term as well. And I think we need to think about the post-COVID-19 recovery as well. So we need to make sure that what we're investing in now in the future is something that will help us sort of address a lot of the climate change and sustainable development goal needs. And interestingly, the bank's pipeline of projects coming up is all on transmission and distribution, most of it, of course, a lot on renewable energy as well, those two, but electricity transmission and distribution by far here in Asia. And I think that stems for the increase in data use and a lot of people being at home as well. Okay, the industry has been affected as well, but there is still a growing electricity demand, maybe not to the growth that we were expecting previously, but there is still high expectations of people that are now at home to have 24/7 electricity. And I experienced that a lot when I was in India during COVID, where constantly the the diesel generator was coming on. And I think in countries like India, the renewable energy uptake is still continuing and moving quite fast. So the transmission distribution systems need to accompany that, and in the past, in most countries, that has not happened. And there's also countries that are still looking at cross-border connectivity as a source of revenue as well. And I think that'll be a challenge maybe in the future when all the countries are looking for to export electricity as well. But I think a lot of the projects that in countries that are hydropower are still there because they want to make sure that revenue is in place. And some of these hydropower projects take time, so they still want to invest in those. So that's sort of, there's probably many more things I could mention, but just in the sake of time, just some things I would like to mention.
Thank you, David. Audrey, please go ahead.
So I think the two big lessons from COVID that the industry has sort of identified is the need for resiliency. I mean, many of us have seen significant changes in the demand profiles and what's happening on the grid, and the grid is held out well. And I think the industry as a whole around the world has done really well in terms of being able to get people home, keep people safe, keep things operational. And I think that to a credit to really the energy industry internationally, it's done extremely well in a surprising circumstance for all of us. The other piece, though, I think was the last point, which is that David mentioned. I think there's an expectation in many economies that a post-COVID recovery will be around infrastructure, will be around energy infrastructure, will be around green technology. And that therefore what we need to do is really think about as we thought about after the GPST was a big recovery around energy and infrastructure, is how do we do this to make sure it's sustainable, that it's not just a lot of cute experiments, but we're actually helping support and accelerate the change. And that's where this need for cross-border, not only working, but collaboration, I think across the industry is going to be very critical, because there's a lot of learnings that we all want to share, and it'll be important to share, because one thing we all know about the power system is that while the economies may be different and there may be lots of regional differences, the physics are the same, and we can learn a lot from each other.
Great, thank you so much. Pat, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Yes, as mentioned, we have been looking at the impact of COVID-19, particularly during the lockdown period, because you see a large drop in Europe, and the drop in demand, that's mean this affect in terms of generation as well. Most of the generation technologies has been dropping in terms of the generation output, except for wind and solar, and that's in a way. It has to, those conventional generation technology has to cope with this impact in terms of providing more flexibility to cope with the lower demand, because you see, minimum demand similar to the weekend period, but on weekday you see the lower minimum demand similar to weekend. So those generation technologies, particularly coal and gas and even nuclear in France, has to adapt to those in providing more flexibility, to accommodate the lower operational costs coming from wind and solar. So it's provided lessons for them that to look at, oh, this is such a rare event, but it has such a high impact that we need to be prepared from the system operation perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Any other thoughts from anyone? Jiwan, please go ahead, and then Dr. Supasa.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with what has already been said. I don't want to repeat, but one point I do want to make here is that now the countries are overstressed with what they have to cope with, and which many of these countries were not really prepared for. So all of their resources, all of their capacity is now geared towards managing this COVID. So we can see that there is a shift in their priorities now. So whatever resources they have, or whatever resources that they can get in from other partners, are going towards their budgetary support, so that they can run their governments, country. And then also more focus is on the health and education. So it's more on the social sectors are going on, which are also very important and is also needed. So what is important for us is that energy or electricity being an essential service that has to run even in the pandemic. So that's why this making our infrastructure, energy infrastructure resilient. I think that's very, very important in our coming days that we should focus on. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Supasa, please.
Yes, thank you. So from the COVID-19 impacts to the energy system, so I just separate into two main points. The first one, of course, we are observed for the demand is actually lower during the pandemic because of many kind of the social distancing measures conducting during the pandemic period. And also this lower demand can actually impacts to the delay of the energy project, especially on power sector, both on fossil fuel and renewable energy installation project. So we found that from most of the ASEAN member states, they also report the new power plant installation is delayed for this year and perhaps for next year. But that will lead to give us the opportunity for bounce back greener in future, give more time to think about the power system to reduce the urgency of install more the fossil fuel and think about the more opportunity for injected more RE power into the system. And the other perspective, which is more like the social area, I think COVID-19 bring us the perspective of we are closer than we thought. So it's not actually like the real border, pandemics can close, the borders very easily. And that's linked to the energy urgent need, for some rural area, which is still there, the challenge for the electricity accessibility. So it's linked to the communication, which still quite challenging sometimes when we would like to communicate or the urgence or what people need to do during the pandemic-19. So that brings the more urgency for the electricity accessibility to the rural area. And I think that can be fulfill the gap with the cross-border project in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Supasa. Dr. Jing, do you have any final thoughts? We have only 1 minute left. If you have anything quick to add, I appreciate it.
Okay, and when we see this COVID-19 shows the importance of electricity, I want to say it also shows the importance of the application of IoT on the electricity system, because this IoT will provide us a possibility for remote monitoring, remote verification, and remote maintenance. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. This has been a really interesting conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I'm really happy that we were all able to hear from all of you and hear really about a wide range of relevant topics and relevant activities going on in your organizations and globally. So I'll just end with a thank you. Thank you both to you and thank you to the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but I appreciate the interest, appreciate your attention. I will only just say, this is really, I think, connectivity, the heart of it is about cooperation, as already said by multiple speakers. And this is what it's really about. We need to cooperate more across a host of areas to really drive the energy system transformation forward in a way that's rapid, equitable, and safe and secure. And speaking of safe and security, I just want to say to everyone, please stay safe, stay healthy. And I do hope we can all see each other in person next year at SIEW 2021. Thank you again for your time, and thank you all. Bye.